Now, here is another angle. I mean, you'll hear a lot of what I'm saying from mainstream media, which, liberals are using this to point to a constitutional crisis because Trump has ignored a court order. But what you won't hear is that first, it was the Biden administration that declared Tren de Aragua as a transnational criminal organization to set the stage for this, while the Biden administration was pushing or seeking to continue the failed temporary protective status policy that lured so many Venezuelans to the US. It was also the Venezuelan opposition, the anti-Maduro opposition that the US was backing, which Trump continues to back, which Elon Musk backed during the election last year, which lured a lot of these men to the US. There are now mothers of these deportees in El Salvador bandying around papers from US-backed parties like Primero Justicia in Venezuela in the streets of Caracas this week, showing that they were tricked into coming to the US, and these papers were printed for them showing they're part of these opposition parties so they could be in the US. Why? Because they wanted to create a domestic lobby inside the US for regime change, because the TPS policy declared that Venezuela was in a state of humanitarian emergency and that the government was illegitimate, which empowered the opposition as the only people to turn to solve the crisis. And it kept their pockets stuffed with USAID money. As long as there was a humanitarian crisis, they were going to get all this USAID money. And as we've reported at the Grayzone, as Anya Parampil reported in her book, Corporate Coup, so much of that money went for them to go to Colombia and buy prostitutes and fancy hotel rooms. And now that these men are all being abused, their own constituents are being abused after they led them to the US, they have nothing to say about it. Like Maria Corina Machado, who is the face and voice of the radical Trump, MAGA, Elon-backed Venezuelan opposition, issued a communique about what was happening with the Alien Enemies Act and all these men. And I'm not going to translate it all for you, but basically no mention of El Salvador, no mention of the abuse of these innocent men who are being portrayed as gangbangers and like hardcore criminals. No defense of them, a total acceptance of Trump's policy because she can't bite the hand that feeds her. Then you have the guy who stood in for her as the candidate for the opposition when she was disqualified, Maria Corina Machado. His name is Edmundo Gonzalez. And he says that he and his team have urged U.S. officials to send Venezuelan deportees to a third country rather than sending them back to Venezuela. Why? Because if you send them straight back to Venezuela, it legitimizes Maduro as the leader, and you have to deal with Maduro. And he's also going to ask you to end sanctions. So it was their idea, the idea of the Trump, MAGA, Elon-backed opposition, which helped lure so many men to the U.S. Carlos Vecchio, the fake U.S. ambassador who served under the fake president Juan Guaido, was helping to Marco Rubio to construct the TPS policy. It was their idea to send them to El Salvador and torture them. And then the last point I want to make here is that now U.S. intelligence, which helped Biden construct his designation of Tren de Aragua as a transnational criminal organization, is now walking that whole thing back now that Trump is in office and admitting that Tren de Aragua poses very little threat inside the United States. And there's no basis for this claim that the U.S. is in a state of war and is being invaded, and that we need to suspend the Constitution in order to carry out these PR shows where just like a few hundred men get tormented in El Salvador to satiate the sadistic desires of Trump's base against migrants. This is from America's Quarterly. America's Quarterly is basically It's basically a US-backed publication. It's backed by corporate America. It's backed by the State Department, USAID. It's spooky. And this article is a very rational take on Tren de Aragua. Which, so what I'm saying, this publication, America's Quarterly, they want to overthrow Maduro. And it would make sense for them to hype up Tren de Aragua and paint it as a threat from Caracas. But they're actually declaring in this article that, this is a direct quote, despite the real threat Tren de Aragua poses to many Venezuelan migrants, it's unlikely the group has much power or reach in the US, where other organized criminal organizations pose much more of a threat to citizens and TDA itself. The alarmism over Tren de Aragua in the US, in short, does not correspond to the facts on the ground as we know them. And this article slams Marco Rubio and Maria Elvira Salazar, the other representative from the Gusano industrial complex in Florida, their petition to Biden that Tren de Aragua is an invading criminal army from a prison in Venezuela that has spread their brutality and chaos to US cities. They're calling it an exaggeration. This is an anti-Maduro publication. And another key point that's made here is the implosion of the Venezuelan economy led to an unprecedented exodus of largely working class and poor Venezuelans and throughout the Americas, including much of the Venezuelan criminal class. So the sanctions that were imposed starting under Obama in 2015, which escalated under Trump, and the various regime change schemes that we saw under Trump, which were assisted by USAID, that has led to 700,000 Venezuelan migrants being here. Then Trump uses that to help himself get elected, claiming America's under occupation, reverses the policy that brought them here, and Venezuelan migrants have been the victims of one of the biggest political rug pulls in recent history, and now they're all designated as enemies. They're living in a state of precarity. Any of them could be sent to a torture prison in El Salvador at any second because there's no due process around them. And the opposition, which has been trying to overthrow Maduro, got so close to Trump and the US government, they can't even defend their people. So I think it's really clear here that the only force that can be dealt with is in Caracas right now. The Venezuelan opposition's totally sold them out. And it's unclear how this is going to be resolved until the US actually cuts a deal over Chevron and sanctions. There won't be the deportations Trump promised. And in the meantime, how much more of these spectacles does Bukele need? I don't think enough. There won't be enough to actually, bring back 700,000 people. This is going to be like one of the major unfolding crises we will see throughout the Trump administration because of the broken Venezuela policy and the nature of the Venezuelan opposition.
Well, as you've just laid out, it's such a cynical policy, creating refugees, migrants, demonizing them and campaigning against them after you've helped create them. Yep. And then, going after people in these sweeping raids and deporting people based on what? That they have tattoos, that
their social media. And one guy got deported because he had a compass tattooed on his arm, but not just deported. It's like, okay, you want to deport people because they're in the country illegally. That's one issue, but deporting them to the supermax prison in El Salvador.
2 points I want to make is I think because Trump and his campaign were the targets of the sort of bipartisan neocon establishment, the sort of Dick Cheney wing and their counterparts on the Democratic side via things like Russiagate and all these other scams like the Russian bounties in Afghanistan, all these scams that were used to undermine Trump. There's this belief among some people that Trump can't then be adopting the exact same policies. Well, he is. He's doing that when it comes to going after migrants, creating them by regime change operations like in Venezuela, which was a neocon operation. John Bolton and Mike Pompeo oversaw it. And also what he's doing now in the US, cracking down on free speech, painting people who oppose genocide as being agents of Hamas and therefore grounds to have their free speech taken away and even deported. The second thing I want to say is, this obviously is a Trump policy, so he owns it. But we should say a word of criticism for the Democrats, who, when Trump unveiled this regime change operation against Venezuela back in 2019.
Yeah.
Democrats applauded it. Nancy Pelosi, at that same speech where she ripped up a copy of Trump's speech, during that speech when Trump recognized, Juan Guaido, the fake president he was trying to install in Venezuela, Pelosi joined the rest of the Democrats in giving him a standing ovation. And what happened when even, on the progressive end of the Democratic Party, when you asked Max on Capitol Hill, AOC, what she thought about all this, she said, if I recall right, she told you that she was going to defer to Democratic leadership on this. So not forming any kind of resistance, any kind of pushback from the progressive elements of the Democratic Party against Pelosi joining with Trump. Now, since then, people like AOC and other progressives have started talking about how we have to lift sanctions on Venezuela because it's creating migrants, but it took them way too long. And certainly now the responsibility is on Trump because he's the one in power now and he's continuing this policy. But Democrats gave him a huge helping hand.
Completely. I mean, and it's the same thing that we saw with European liberals on Syria, where they were willing to welcome masses of migrants, but they were supporting the policy that was creating the migrants in the first place. All of them supported the dirty war on Syria. So they're all complicit in this. And the TPS policy was designed to feed the Venezuelan opposition and give them this giant lobby inside the United States. It was all based on fear and exaggeration of the power of this group, Tren de Aragua. Even if you look at DHS statistics on how many of the Venezuelan migrants have been arrested for gang ties, it's like 0.5%. It's a tiny, or 0.05%. It's a tiny percentage by their own exaggerated statistics. And I threw up the headline from the New York Times now, where U.S. intelligence is now saying, now that Trump is in office, Tren de Aragua doesn't pose that much of a threat. So they've just created a disastrous situation that Trump has taken advantage of to invalidate the Constitution, to abrogate courts. And how far will it go? It's going to continue going further. And it's also of a part with what Trump is doing to Mahmoud Khalil and other students who are either here on student visas or green cards simply because of their political speech. There's no due process for them. Mahmoud Khalil has not been accused of a crime. Has habeas corpus been suspended? Well, that's really what will be determined there as Mahmoud Khalil returns to New Jersey to be tried. A judge has ruled he can't just be held in Louisiana and then deported. Has Trump suspended habeas corpus? Are we in a state of war? On behalf of who? On behalf of Israel? Because that's who Mahmoud Khalil is said to threaten, not the United States.